Hello, I'm Dr. Steve Hassan with another episode of my podcast renamed as Cult Conversations, The Influence Continuum with Dr. Steve Hassan. I have an old friend with me and colleague, Stephen J. Gelberg, lives out in the Bay Area. And Steve and I go back a number of years. Just going to read a little of your bio, Steve. You have a new book coming out that we're going to get to in a second. But you are a writer, an independent scholar living in the San Francisco Bay Area. And you were recruited or got involved with the Hare Krishna or ISKCON organization from ages 18 to 35. And to name the dates, it's 1970 to 1987, where you were the movement's chief liaison to the international academic community. You were doing PR, I guess, and its director for interreligious affairs. And in 83, Grove Press published a volume of in-depth interviews, Hare Krishna, 5 distinguished scholars on the Krishna movement in the West. And during those years, you lectured at colleges, universities, and now you've been, since exiting, learning a lot, writing critically about the Krishnas, and have been published in a number of academic books and journals. And you also went to Harvard Divinity School, where you got a master's degree in 1990. And your most read thing that I'm aware of regarding Krishna, Steve, is On Leaving ISKCON, which was published online and has helped many potential and recent recruits walk away from getting involved with this group. And I'll just say, if people don't know, My Sweet Lord and other George Harrison songs are from his Krishna period. So he was very into it. I'm going to ask you to describe the history of Prabhupada and the organization a bit in 1 second. But I want to just finish the bio because you're a distinguished visual artist, photographer, hand printing thousands of images in a home darkroom. And you also wrote a memoir called India in a Mind's Eye, Travels and Ruminations from an Ambivalent Pilgrim, which is a fascinating read. And your new book that's coming out is very interesting, dealing with psychedelic mysticism. I've had a number of guests on, Steve, about psychedelics and such, as well as mysticism. The new book that's coming out is called Tuning In, Experiencing Music in Psychedelic States. And that will be published by an academic press, the State University of New York Press. So with that, Steve Gelberg, welcome to the Influence Continuum, my friend.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Yeah. So let's start with, for my audience that really doesn't know anything about the Hare Krishna movement, except seeing some people in Airplane or Woody Allen movies or George Harrison. Tell us about ISKCON.
Well, I'll be brief. The Christian movement really has receded from the public eye in recent decades. Back decades ago, let's say well into the 80s perhaps, Hare Krishna was a household word or term because there had been a lot of popular media depictions, usually of a comical nature, of those bald-headed, orange-robed,
banging drums, dancing in the streets, and
playing cymbals and playing
selling
drums.
flowers and other
right. So
things.
there was a very simplistic public image of the Krishnas, but behind it is a history. I mean, what we call Hinduism is extremely complex.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, just like as in Christianity, you have many denominations and even major divisions like Catholicism and Protestantism.
Sure.
Same with Hinduism. And within Hinduism, you have monist traditions in which The idea is, you are God or you merge into God. And then you have devotional traditions, which are more comparable to Christianity or Judaism, where there's me and there's God, and I worship God and I pray for salvation, or the word in Hinduism more commonly is liberation. So the Krishna movement comes from that devotional tradition focused on Krishna. There are Hindus that worship Shiva, and there are Hindus that worship the mother goddess, Durga. But Krishna worship is a very large division within Hinduism. So the founder of the Hare Krishna movement was a monk in that tradition, and his guru, way back in the 30s, had told him, go to the West and spread these teachings. And then finally in 1966, Swami Bhaktivedanta sailed from India to New York, and he had very little with him. He didn't have institutional backing. It's a sort of legendary story of coming with a few dollars in his pocket, but with great devotion to his teacher, mission to spread the word. So he kind of landed, the time and place was maximally advantageous. If he had come in the 50s or the 70s, it's possible nobody would have paid attention, but he came smack dab in the beginning of the flowering of the hippie counterculture, where a lot of young people, and that's my generation, were primed for interest in self-realization, enlightenment. A lot of us were experimenting with psychedelics, mainly LSD back in those days. These days, it's more psilocybin and other things. But LSD was having a tremendous effect back then. And what it tended to do is provide most people who tried it a very cosmic, transcendent, ineffable, impossible to describe experience. And so that led many people into an active interest in Eastern religions, because you had many bridges being built between the psychedelic culture and Eastern religions. You had Ram Dass very prominently, Richard Alpert, who had been the associate of Timothy Leary,
right, at Harvard.
And he had been deeply, profoundly transformed by LSD. He went to India, found a guru, and came back himself a kind of guru figure. He wrote Be Here Now, which was a countercultural bestseller. It's been in print since.
Yeah. And I'll just add, nobody's ever complained to me about being in a destructive authoritarian cult of Ram Dass.
Right. Well, Ram Dass is a good example of a guru figure who is not sectarian and not that I have the only truth.
Right.
He's a very Catholic-minded, can we say, Hindu teacher, and he's a good antidote to a lot of the we have the whole truth, nobody else does, sectarian, cultish forms of Hinduism that appeared, of which the Hare Krishna movement is a prime example. So you had him, and you had Allen Ginsberg. The first person I heard the Hare Krishna chant from was Ginsberg at one of the big anti-Vietnam War demonstrations in New York. So you had people who were very prominent in the counterculture pointing east and saying there is wisdom there, there is profundity there. So a lot of us young psychedelic explorers ended up reading the Bhagavad Gita or Buddhist texts, and there were really vast numbers of young people who were exploring in that area.
Right.
And it so happened that the Krishnas made themselves very visible.
Yeah.
they weren't just scholars, sitting in their studies studying ancient texts. They were out there on the streets, in the parks, chanting Hare Krishna.
And they were recruiting for money and members.
And recruiting and inviting people to come to the Sunday love feast.
Free vegetarian food. I've heard many people go for the food.
And so they were very intriguing image of people who had really kind of left the world. I mean, to conventional mentality, they would have appeared just very weird, maybe even crazy. But to a seeker who is prepared to entertain very non-mainstream conceptions of reality, here are these people with shaved heads, in the case of the men, sort of fearlessly, openly chanting a foreign mantra on the streets. And there was something very appealing about that and very attractive to many of the chanting, because it was a form of meditation. And these people who were chanting seemed to be in a higher state of consciousness. They were dancing.
They seemed super stoned, when I met them.
So here are these people that would appear to be experiencing something that I, a young seeker, is exploring and interested in. So no wonder within a few years, literally thousands of people had dropped out of college or, and left their families and become Hare Krishnas. All sorts of people.
Right.
But basically seekers. So the golden age of the Krishna movement was really from 66 until, let's say, the mid-70s.
Mm-hmm.
And then the anti-cult movement came alive, especially in 1978 with Jonestown, where people had that cult.
I got out of the Moonies in 76, and that's when I started meeting ex-Krishna people and learning stuff like Prabhupada thought women had smaller brains than men and therefore were not as intelligent, or the sun was closer to the earth than the moon.
Right.
And other things that were
because the
odd.
Krishna movement is rooted in a very traditional and culturally conservative form of Hinduism, you find concepts in the Krishna movement that are rather objectionable to a modern progressive or even not so progressive mentality, viewing women as lesser than men, and, all kinds of strange ideas. So the anti-cult movement began to shine a light on some of these more aberrational concepts.
And then there were, illegal activities some members were caught doing, and then the West Virginia Temple and Keith Ham gave the group a bad name.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of history there, but to summarize it very briefly, like a lot of world-saving cults, the mentality of the ends justifies the means came into prominence.
Yeah.
And people who otherwise might have been instinctually ethical-minded were sold on the idea that it's so important we spread this word, this teaching, that it's okay to kind of fudge about the truth. And so when you're fundraising, you can tell people we're raising money for children or for this or that or anything.
Transcendental trickery was their term compared to heavenly deception of the Moonies.
Yeah.
That's my...
So you could say that, beginning in the early to mid 70s, the movement went through a kind of transition. And people, in the movement began questioning and leaving. I certainly began. I was never a fan of those things. The idea is that what we have is so important that you can lie to people about where the money's going. So the movement became institutionalized, corporatized. And so there was a general shift. And this is a common pattern if you read sociology of religion.
Right.
New religions tend to follow that path from being very sort of pure-minded and idealistic to becoming much more instrumentalist in their motives. We need to make money now to grow the movement,
Right.
so we'll do what we need to do to make money. So there was a gradual, corporatization,
Right.
institutionalization, the sociologists say,
Yep.
of the movement, which grew worse and worse and gradually led to many members sort of questioning these kind of policies.
Yeah, because I think that it became full-blown authoritarian cult from my work with ex-members that I worked with and such. And abuse of children, I remember meeting kids.
Yes, so child abuse became an issue, which is something I left in 87, and I didn't begin to hear about that until not long before I left. So a lot of bad things were happening behind the scenes that most members were not even aware of.
Always the case.
One of them being really bad child abuse, horrible, disgusting, horrific, psychological, physical abuse of children.
Right. So let's move on, and I'll just add, from my understanding, let me just add this historical piece. He died and didn't designate a successor, and so there were a bunch of senior people who all fanned out claiming to be the real successor, and some of these guys were bad actors.
It's a little different than that, in that he appeared to have appointed successors, but shortly thereafter, after he passed away, questions were raised about, was this literally an appointment or just naming of senior people to carry the movement on? So very shortly after the founder passed away in 77, which was only 11 years after having founded the organization, the movement fell into political turmoil because there were questions about who's in charge,
right,
and who can initiate new disciples. And ego came roaring back on the part of the senior young male American leaders, all in their 20s or early 30s. And basically, the movement as a corporate body began to fall apart.
Yeah.
And this made the environment, the internal environment of the organization, very much less pleasant than it had been at one time. And people began leaving in droves over the next, many years.
Interesting. So before we started recording, Steve, I asked you about Tulsi Gabbard and Chris Butler, and would you mind repeating what you said about how Chris had his own group and then got into the Krishna?
Right. I'm not an expert on that particular group, but I'll tell you that Chris Butler, who is her guru,
Tulsi Gabbard's guru, yeah.
Tulsi Gabbard's guru, who lives in Hawaii, I believe.
Yeah.
He had been a sort of independent guru in Hawaii. He later became a disciple of the Hare Krishna guru and sort of turned over his organization to ISKCON, the Krishna movement. I remember when there was an influx of his followers into the Krishna movement around 71, around that time. Mm-hmm. Eventually, he left with some of his followers. So Tulsi Gabbard basically sees this Chris Butler, who has his own teachings, but is sort of spiritually affiliated with, but separate from the Krishna movement. And she also expresses her fealty to the Krishna movement founder. So
Prabhupada.
Prabhupada.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have the information to tell you where the two disagree from each other theologically, but she does have her heart is with Chris Butler and Prabhupada, and so the teachings of ISKCON are certainly something that deeply influenced her.
Right.
And when I now and then hear commentators on TV and elsewhere speak about her, usually the thing they bring up is the homophobia, which her group, Chris Butler's group, is.
And Prabhupada's group was homophobic.
Quite well known from, and also Prabhupada's group. But the Krishna movement also is very misogynistic. They try to hide that. They don't like talking about it. They know it's not popular. But if you go to Prabhupada's books, he repeats what he learned from his Hindu tradition about women being lesser and needing to be always under the control of a man and less spiritually adept than men are. Absurd notions, which, though Tulsi may not preach, she very well may. I cannot say definitively. I don't know her mind.
Right.
But she is tied closely to a tradition that is both homophobic and misogynistic.
Yes. So, Steve, I'm not going to ask you to go through your all of the points in your writing of why on leaving Krishna. But can you just share with my listeners a few of the key reasons that you decided to, after so many years in such a high position, walked away?
Well, going back to what I was saying earlier, I was watching the disintegration of what to me had been something very beautiful. And I had help from the fact that when I was in this, you mentioned I kind of act as an outreach person to the academic community. Now, it was PR, but it was more than PR because I was invited by sociologists to give papers on ISKCON within a sociological context. So I basically self-educated in the sociology as well as the history of religions. So I could be a literate inside source of information to the academic.
And I remember you telling me you learned about the Moonies in that period. So while you were interacting.
That's a whole other story. Just as a tease, I'll mention that when the anti-cult movement came out and said, look at these cults, the Hare Krishnas and the Moonies, we thought we weren't a cult or comparable to any other cult. So I wanted to know what the Moonies were about. So I put a wig on over my shaved head and put on regular clothes and got myself recruited to attend one of their infamous weekend intensive workshops. And so I was an undercover Hare Krishna in a Mooney workshop.
That's hysterical.
It's something that I wish I'd written up because it was actually pretty funny. Laying in the morning under my covers of my bed, chanting my Hare Krishna mantra before having to get up. But yes, it was a surreal experience. But at least I learned that there are gradations of brainwashing, and that the Moonies were a kind of more intensive gradation, I think, of brainwashing than there was in the Krishnas. But I was very, I went out into academia because I knew there were scholars and doctoral students writing books and dissertations on ISKCON, and I put myself out there as a resource, someone who could arrange interviews and even travel with people who were studying ISKCON. So I was someone who was sort of inside and outside. And that outside connection, learning sociology, religion, gave me enough perspective an intellectual perspective on the development of cults and sects to help me realize that ISKCON was going through a process which was not healthy in terms of a fealty to its original spiritual promise, that it was just, becoming an institutional corporate body.
Right.
So that perspective, which was available to very few Krishna devotees, aided me in getting a sense of perspective. But it was enough just to be in ISKCON and to see the infighting and the cracks in the institution, that I began to realize this is not a very promising place to spend the rest of my life. And I had, by that time, enough of an initiation into the academic study of religion that I had a place to go. I decided I'd just go and study religion in the university. So I had a kind of parachute.
And were you in touch with your family during those many years?
On and off. There were years when I wasn't. Closer to the time I left, I was. And I had let them know that I was questioning my involvement. And actually, my father had said at one point, if you leave, Steve, we will support you, and you can go back to school and get back to your life. And just a day after he made that explicit offer, I called back and said, yes, I'd like to do that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. To give an exit ramp is how I describe it to people who are in these groups, without going, you should have listened to me. I told you the group was bad. You just go, hey, if you ever want to try something different, or you want to take a break, we're here for you. We'll help.
Right. And the best single advice that when I'm in a position that I give to parents of members of cults, is stay in touch somehow or other. Don't let, even though your child may have changed and seems like a stranger and doesn't want to talk to you, keep a line of contact open, because it is quite possible that eventually they will take advantage of that connection and ask for your help in some manner.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I think we've covered, I have all kinds of memories popping up from days when I was helping people leaving the Krishnas, like thought stopping, like one of the sins was speculation. There were some lists of things that you weren't supposed to do, and one of them was weren't supposed to speculate.
Well, right, like most groups that want to keep you focused on the core teachings and to keep you safely settled within a particular mindset.
Yep.
Every group has its practices for keeping the mind in the right place. Yeah. And in the Krishna movement, it was chanting. And so, doubts, are the enemy of blind faith. And so if you feel doubts, you just need to think about Krishna, chant Hare Krishna.
Yep.
So, something that should go on the blog accompanying this is that there's a major feature documentary released just recently, within the last few days, on ISKCON.
Oh.
That Nori was very instrumental in. And
do you remember the name of it?
I I can't think of it at the moment.
Okay, well,
But
people can
it
check
should
our
be added there.
blogs and we'll put a link
Yeah,
to.
I was interviewed for it. Nori was interviewed for it.
You're referring to Nori Muster, who wrote a great book called Betrayal of the
Yes,
Spirit about
right.
her time in the Hare Krishnas.
And it's based on the book Monkey on a Stick, which you're probably familiar with.
Yes, I have it, behind me on the bookshelf of a murderer. I think it was Steve Bryant was killed, a former member of the group.
Right.
So, so let's shift gears to your new book and what made you decide to do a scholarly book on music and psychedelics. Tell us about your project.
Well, I had been, before I joined ISKCON, that is between the ages of 15 and 18, during the flowering of the counterculture.
Yeah.
I was very interested in psychedelics. I was doing LSD, not doing it for the thrill of it, although there was thrill, but I found the experiences very philosophically and spiritually inspiring, and quite mind-blowing. And those experiences, as I mentioned earlier, were instrumental were a part of my journey into ISKCON, because the psychedelic experience points to a spiritual universe beyond the one that we know. And in recent years, I had begun thinking about, because it's an interest that survived 17 years in the Krishnas, and shortly after I left the Krishna movement, I returned to occasional tripping, mostly LSD, and then the so-called psychedelic renaissance began growing, I guess the first seeds in the 80s and then growing in the 90s, as the government began to loosen up on restrictions for scientists doing clinical studies of possible psychotherapeutic benefits of psychedelics, such as psilocybin, magic mushrooms, and ecstasy. And it just struck me at one point that there had been nothing systematic written on the subject of the role of music in psychedelics.
Right.
Almost every psychedelic experience, whether it's independent, just somebody doing it with their friends, or in formal psychotherapeutic settings, or formal clinical settings where studies are being done by neurologists and others, usually some music is played during the experience, because it has a calming and centering and other beneficial effects. And actually, before I began even thinking about the book, I had just started assembling a playlist of music that I thought would be particularly good to listen to. I'd found that when I occasionally would trip, that listening to music was an entirely different and greatly enriched experience. Music itself entered a different region of experience. It was the same music, but heard with a much more profoundly deeper receptivity. These things, of course, are kind of beyond easy descriptive words, but listening to music was really an ecstatic experience.
Well, it is for a lot of people who aren't tripping. They
well, of course,
totally get into some amazing music.
Sure.
And they go to a different place.
And of course, everybody knows that, psychedelics were very widely used by musicians of the 60s, Grateful Dead, obviously, the Beatles, obviously, especially George Harrison and John Lennon, well, Paul also, were profoundly influenced by LSD, and their music was
Right.
Profoundly influenced.
Right.
So I began putting together playlists for myself, then decided to expand them and share them on Spotify. And then at some point, as I said before, I kind of realized nobody's really. I had read a lot of the contemporary and older psychedelic literature, which covers many areas, but no one book and only a few articles had focused on music. So I thought, I'm going to write that book.
Yeah.
And I had enough background in the psychedelic literature and enough of the temperament of a scholar and researcher, the patience to read a lot of books and to do a lot of mental work, that I decided I'm going to do that. So I threw myself into the project really around 10 years ago, and it evolved slowly. And then when it had evolved to a certain point, I began seeking a publisher, found a publisher. We're very fortunate to find an academic publisher by which the book, would be taken more seriously than if it was simply one of the publishers that churn out a lot of psychedelic books.
Right.
And I worked very hard on it, and I read everything in print, just about, on psychedelics, brought together everything anybody had written on the subject, digested it, processed it, and it formed itself, in a sense, into a study. And it's not a dry academic study. It's a lot of footnotes and bibliography, so acceptable to formal scholarship. But it quotes extensively from people describing either during or after their psychedelic experiences, their experiences listening to different kinds of music. A lot of it's classical, but also ambient music and world music and other genres as well. So it's both sort of a theoretical study of the whole field, why music sounds so much better, how music opens up the subconscious, and why psychotherapists have found it a way to access deep strata of the subconscious and childhood experiences to bring to the fore things that are normally not accessible in our conscious minds. And then also have a lot of, as I say, first-person testimony, spoken or written during or after trips. So
you did interviews for your book, in other words?
No, I didn't do interviews. I relied very heavily on published trip reports.
I see.
Especially from the earlier literature, because the earlier psychedelic literature from the 60s and 70s was really interested in what is the experience, whereas the later sort of psychedelic science literature is more interested in looking at what's happening in the brain.
Right, the neuroscience stuff.
Right,
probably.
so psychedelic studies really has, unfortunately, changed from a more humanistic study of what are people experiencing as psychological, spiritual beings to what is going on in the gray matter. And so this book is in part a corrective against the overly reductionistic neurological study of psychedelics, and really looking at what is it that the human being is experiencing as a human being, emotionally, existentially, ontologically.
It's a fascinating topic. And as you know, I'm sure, there's been a resurgence in the application of use of psychedelics with psychotherapy. So in fact, I've been invited to speak at a Harvard conference on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, I'll be talking about my influence continuum and bite model and how
Right.
people are claimed to be shamans and, give people ayahuasca and then grope them or rape them and other
Right.
bad things.
As in any therapeutic or group situation, there's room for abuse.
Yep.
So sadly, it's also visited upon psychedelic community, where, as you say, sometimes people do psychedelics and it goes to their head and they think they become enlightened and they start calling themselves shamans.
Right.
And so, yes, there is plenty of room for abuse in that community. And so there is certainly application for your notions about mind control in that area.
But going back to the academic pursuit of your work, it just seems to me like if a legitimate therapist is using psychedelic assisted approaches, use of the right music might really assist dramatically in, you were mentioning, maybe unearthing material that had been.
Yes. Initially so, because the most common cause of so-called bad trip is that one is unable to let go to the experience, because the things are happening within your mind, they're strange. And if you try to fight it, if the ego comes to the fore and tries to remain within so-called normal consciousness, there's a tendency then to panic and think, oh, what do I do?
Yeah, out of control, right? You're out of control.
So there really is a need to let go, as they say. And initially, in a psychedelic experience, therapeutic or otherwise, formal or otherwise, there's a need just to flow with the experience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In one of the Beatles songs, famously, they paraphrase, actually almost quote from an Eastern text, turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. So there are times when it's not unhealthy, but healthy to turn off the mind, relax, and float downstream when you're entering into a genuine spiritual experience. So one of the main uses of music in psychedelic context is simply to put on some very calming, gentle, like ambient music, so the mind can, relax. And then in later stages of a psychedelic experience, music can be, depending on the mood and quality, the temper of the movement, can move one into different phases of memory or consciousness, and just be a very valuable tool for accessing normally inaccessible strata of consciousness.
Yep. I'd like to just quote an endorsement for your new book, your forthcoming book, from Dr. Alan L. Combs, who's written prolifically on consciousness study. He said about your book, Tuning In, Experiencing Music in Psychedelic States, quote, a beautifully written and engagingly personal account of the ancient and again burgeoning marriage of music and psychedelics, two universally powerful prescriptions for expanding consciousness. This is a landmark work for a time of rediscovery and exploration of the possibilities of unlimited conscious experience, unquote. Nice quote.
It's a great quote.
So who's going to read your book other than listeners of my podcast? And who do you think would be the core audience that would want to pick up your book, read it, and really think about it?
Core audience would be anyone who is interested in the subject of psychedelics as a subject, even if they're not doing psychedelics. Anyone who, for any reason, is experimenting with psychedelics, who listens to music and who would like to get some insight into how they can go deeper into the experience. The book also includes an appendix listing different recommended works. There are links also to extensive playlists, which I have on Spotify. So it's a kind of guide to music and to what people have said about the experience of music. And psychedelic therapists, and that's becoming really a growing field, I recommend my book to them because it gives a lot of guidance to how music specifically has been used and can be used within psychedelic therapy to aid the therapy. It's not just a background thing like have flowers or pretty pictures.
Right.
It really music plays a very active, beneficent role in the therapeutic process. So it's a guide for therapists and it's a guide for practitioners.
And so
really any of those publics.
I'm interested in reading it for sure. So on Spotify, which I subscribe to, is it Stephen J. Gelberg or?
Yeah, if you simply do a search for Stephen Gelberg, no space, no capitals, just STEVENGELBERG, just search that and you'll find my page there where there are about 40 playlists.
Wow.
Most of them are specifically geared to psychedelics, like classical music for psychedelic states, ambient music for psychedelics, world music for psychedelic states, and a lot of others. There are a number of different ambient playlists and a number of different classical playlists. There's a tribal list. And so far, about 13,000 people have become followers of all of the lists cumulatively. So the playlists have been there up for a number of years and have a large following.
I hope you make some money from making the playlists, or maybe you.
Well, no. Not from the playlists.
So buy his book, people.
Buy my book. I didn't do it for the money.
Right.
Anyone who knows publishing knows that writers get a very small, even tiny percentage of the proceeds.
Right.
I did it. It's really a labor of love.
Yeah.
I just found this wealth of information, which has the most practical applications, and wanted to share it.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Just as I wanted to share the music itself.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm wondering what else to say or ask you about in terms of either the book or what. Maybe you can just take a few minutes and talk about your earlier book, India in a Mind's Eye, Travels and Ruminations of an Ambivalent Pilgrim.
Sure.
Ambivalent
first,
Pilgrim.
Let me first mention, though, that the tuning in, experiencing music in psychedelic states is available for pre-order on Amazon. So if you just search tuning in, there are a few other books with the same title, but search Gelberg tuning in and you'll find the book with a beautiful cover.
Yes.
And I think it'll be in the warehouse in February, but the official publication date is April 1st.
Okay.
Now, as far as the other book, which you mentioned,
tell us about India.
Read the title again.
India in a Mind's Eye, Travels and Ruminations of an Ambivalent Pilgrim.
It's based on a very detailed journal that I kept the last time I went to India, which was way back in 1986.
Okay, before you left the Krishnas then.
It was about a year before I left the Krishnas. It was the 11th or 12th trip that I'd made to India. And I decided for some reason to just keep a very detailed journal. I thought perhaps I'll use the journal as the basis for a book. That's what happened. So it's basically a travelogue describing visiting various major cities in India, but also visiting some of the major Hare Krishna centers in India. So the book is sort of split between simply descriptions of India by somebody who'd been there many times and who had a sense of the terrain, but also someone who, in the Hare Krishna movement who is exploring his own spiritual roots, but also in a time of doubt and questioning about the Krishna movement. Right. Sort of putting it against the background of Hinduism in India. And so, although I was still in ISKCON, I expressed very serious concerns and doubts about the direction of the movement. Therefore, the subtitle, Reflections of an Ambivalent Pilgrim, because I was, of two minds. And so it got some very good reviews. One academic reviewer, I don't have the words in front of me, but he said, and I say this with humility, he says, well, one of the best travelogues ever written. So that's not me saying that. That's
right.
Professor Hopkins from Franklin and Marshall College.
Nice.
But like anything I write, I put a lot of time and thought and heart into it.
Yep.
And it's a good read, if I can say. But that I self-published that, and that's available from blurb.com, which is a self-publishing website. And I put no profit on it, so it's very inexpensive.
Yeah. So we'll put a link.
And I think in the blog that you'll have accompanying this, there'll be a picture of it.
For sure.
And a link.
And we'll do a link. And one of the things that I said to you before we started recording is, Steve, I'm really on a quest to get more folks who've been involved with deep, commitment groups, cults, etc., to not be embarrassed, not be ashamed, kind of, be willing to share their journey now that they're out and they're successful, because there's this misconception that you have to be stupid or weak or uneducated to ever be in a cult group, which is patently not true. And that there's life after cult. And in particular, because my last book is The Cult of Trump, I am very confident that in the years ahead, there will be millions of people realizing that Trump is not a good president, that he is not interested in the working class at all. And I want people to feel open to leaving and not feeling like they were stupid or something, like understanding their mind got hacked. So
right. And for a lot of followers of Trump, it's not that they necessarily made an independent intellectual judgment of which political leader to follow, right, but they live in cultural environments in which it's a given either that you were a Republican, or even if you're Republican and there's a aberrational candidate, you should follow that person. So for whatever reason, it's possible to believe very, very deeply in something one day and the next day or the next year realize that, to experience cognitive dissonance, to realize that things are not what they seem.
Or what you want to believe they are.
What you want to believe. And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in. Yeah. It's very painful to realize or begin to wonder whether you were wrong. In fact, the first or second sentence of my essay on leaving ISKCON is exactly that, saying that one of the most difficult things in life is to have given yourself to an ideology, a teaching, a belief,
A guru.
whether it's religious, political, to any group, wholeheartedly, and to stake everything on it, and then to come to a point where you realize that the cracks begin to appear.
Mm.
And it's very scary when you sort of based your self identity and your concept of reality on something which is beginning to fade. And there's a sense of free falling and
I had that
wanting
feeling,
to.
like I
Sure,
I was falling off a skyscraper when I.
it can be terrifying. So whether it's that one is changing a religious or political or any other kind of commitment, it's one of the scariest, most disorienting, and ego challenging experiences a human being can have. And yes, you survive it.
Yeah.
You survive it because there are others who've been through the same path and who are there to catch you as you fall.
Yeah.
You just need to seek them out,
Yes.
find people who have been through what you've been through. And by being outside whatever the group is, or teaching whatever they've gained wisdom
Mm-hmm.
in how to deal with the change and adjustment. So
Yeah.
take advantage of people who have been through a similar path.
Yeah, you're not alone. I can't help, while I was listening to you speak, to think back earlier to this conversation where you were describing when people are tripping, to let go, surrender, go down river. There was something that just really connected for me in this interview with you about that notion of, you know what, I believed what I believed based on my information, my experiences at the time. Now I know more, and let
Right.
go and just like see how your life evolves.
Right. And obviously, one can let go into a beautiful experience or into a very confining and illusioning experience.
Right.
And I can understand why someone who is as deeply absorbed in notions about brainwashing might be a little skeptical about the notion of surrendering to a psychedelic experience.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a fact that if you're dealing with any attempt to change or evolve consciousness, even though there may conceivably be risks there with bad actors acting the role of teacher or meditation teacher, whatever, there are circumstances in which it is a healthy, psychologically healthy and spiritually helpful thing to get out of your own head, get out of your own way in order to experience something different.
Yeah. I have to confess, I'm scared to do LSD. You don't know who's made it and how pure it is and what dose and all of that. And I did go to a party when I was 17, Steve. I don't think I shared this with you or even the public, but I went to a party and I had some punch and no one told me that it was spiked with LSD, and I had a very bad experience.
Well, that's the worst possible setting because it comes as a shock.
Yeah.
You have no preparation.
Yeah. No one told me
And
what's happening to my mind.
Anybody who knows anything about psychedelics tells you need preparation.
Yeah.
A lot of preparation. So the worst thing anyone can do is to dose somebody without their knowledge. It's a stupid and a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, the CIA did it. One of their people jumped out of a window. I think it was Eric Olson.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
right.
It's it's a very interesting time that we live in, and the thing I've been focusing on the most lately, Steve, is the whole online digital algorithm use of hypnosis online stuff. And it's just, the wild, wild west is happening online, and a lot of people are getting radicalized and don't understand what's happening to their mind.
Well, unfortunately, we live in a world where not everyone has pure motives in dealing with other human beings. It's a place where you want to be able to have trust,
Right.
but a place where you can't always.
Yeah.
And it's a shame when you lose trust to the extent of becoming jaded and cynical. That's a very sad thing.
Yeah.
So one has to be cautious in any area, whether it's religion or psychedelics or politics or whatever it may be.
Yep.
This is a strange world we live in.
Strange world. And I say it's your mind and only you should control it. And I'm emphasizing have real friends in real life and don't look for anonymous followers who may be bots or, might be people who are.
And the reason why you have to avoid that is because anyone who would disassociate you from your own deepest intuition is not your friend. Anyone that says, one can use Eastern religions to say, don't trust your own mind, or one can use teaching about meditation to say, don't trust your own mind. But that can have two very different meanings. And if the person stating that doctrine has impure motives, don't trust your mind can mean trust me and check out of your own interior sense of reality, your own intuition, your own deepest wisdom, and trust me.
Yeah, Rajneeshas of the world. Leave your shoes and your mind outside the ashram.
Right. So that notion, however beautiful a place it may have originated, can be twisted into a very dark place. So the main thing is to learn to trust your own intuition.
Yeah.
To get everything else out of your mind other than your own innate deepest wisdom. And it's there.
Yes, it is.
Jesus said the kingdom of God is within you. That's another way of saying the deepest wisdom. Or there are spiritual guides or, spirit guides or guardian angel, whatever. However you think of the idea of inner wisdom, it's there. It can be accessed, but if your mind is being pulled in many different directions by others, it's hard to access that.
Right, exactly.
And I remember really that my gradual process of realizing that I didn't want to any longer be in the Krishna movement was when I began really reflecting deeply on how am I feeling here and why doesn't it feel right and what's wrong.
You're paying attention to your doubts, to your thoughts.
Yeah, paying attention to your doubts.
Yep. So I want to thank you, Stephen J. Gelberg, author of a forthcoming book called Tuning In, Experiencing Music in Psychedelic States, to be published by the State University of New York Press. You've helped write a widely read essay on leaving ISKCON in 1992. That's on Nori Muster's site, I believe. Is it surrealist.org still?
I think it's called surrealist.org. But anyone that's interested in that essay, which I feel is the best thing I've ever done because it really has helped a lot of people sort of think through their involvement in ISKCON and other groups. It's just Google on leaving ISKCON. ISKCON.
Great.
It's actually at a few different sites, but you'll find it.
Yep. So I want to thank you, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.